The night Sarah Mitchell decided to stop being afraid, she was sitting on a soaked cardboard flat outside a thrift shop on North Avenue in Baltimore, counting $287 for the fifth time that hour. As if the number might change. As if hoping hard enough could turn quarters into something that mattered. Her daughter Emma was asleep across her lap, 7 years old, holding the same threadbare bear she'd carried since the funeral. The rain had stopped, but the cold had not. Sarah pressed her palm against her daughter's shoulder and felt the full weight of a 7-year-old's belief that her mother was going to fix everything. She did not yet know about the letter waiting at the shelter on Fayette Street. She did not know that a woman named Margaret Whitlock had died in Vermont 3 months earlier at the age of 87, leaving behind 84 acres of land, a farmhouse built in 1847, and a brass key engraved with 2 words in Latin that meant, "The truth sets free." She did not know that the land had been waiting 160 years for someone to come back for what was buried there. She did not know that 12 people had once made a promise on that hill, a promise her own great-great-grandmother had sworn to keep. She only knew she had $287 a sleeping child, and the kind of stubbornness that does not announce itself because it does not need to. That was enough to begin. The night Sarah Mitchell decided to stop being afraid, the rain over Baltimore had finally let up, leaving the gutters running brown, and the streetlights doubled in every puddle on North Avenue. She was sitting on a flattened cardboard box outside a thrift shop that had closed 3 hours earlier. Her back against the iron security gate, her daughter Emma asleep across her lap, with the same threadbare bear the girl had carried since her father's funeral 3 years before. Sarah was 31 years old. She had $287 folded into the inside pocket of a winter coat that had seen better winters. She had counted the money 5 times in the last hour, as if the number might somehow rearrange itself into something larger if she counted it correctly, as if hope could turn quarters into rent. She pressed her palm against her daughter's shoulder and felt the small, steady warmth of a 7-year-old who still believed with the absolute certainty that children carried before the world educated it out of them that her mother was going to fix everything. That belief was the heaviest thing Sarah had ever carried. She closed her eyes for a moment, just a moment, and let her head rest against the cold metal of the gate behind her. She did not allow herself to cry. She had not allowed herself to cry in 8 months since the last apartment had gone, since the eviction notice and the storage unit and the slow erasure of every object that had once meant something. She had decided somewhere along the way that tears were a luxury she could not afford until Emma was safe. Emma was not yet safe. The dream came to her then in the strange half-sleep of a woman too cold to rest and too tired to stay awake. She saw a black woman in a long, dark dress standing at the edge of a field. She did not recognize the woman's hands held out toward her. The woman's face calm and certain, and somehow familiar in a way Sarah could not place. The woman said very clearly in a voice that did not feel like a dream voice, "They are waiting for you to find them." Sarah opened her eyes. The street was the same street. The rain was still gone. Emma had not moved, but Sarah felt sitting there in the cold that something in her had shifted by a degree she could not name. She did not know yet that across 2 states in a small Vermont town she had never heard of, a letter had been waiting for her for 91 days. She did not know that everything was about to begin. The shelter on Fayette Street had a policy of not opening before 7 in the morning, even in weather that made the sidewalks treacherous. Sarah and Emma arrived at 6:43, joining a line of 15 people who had all learned through the same hard education that arriving early was the only way to be sure of a bed. A woman named Denise ran the front desk. She was in her late 50s, gray hair pulled back in a way that suggested she had stopped caring about her appearance somewhere around the time she had started caring more about other people's lives than her own. She had been at the shelter for 19 years. She had watched thousands of women come and go. She liked Sarah. She did not say so because saying things at a shelter was a kind of currency that had to be spent carefully. But she watched Sarah help Emma with her shoes and noticed the careful way the woman folded her daughter's coat and registered in the small private file she kept in her head about the people who passed through her care that Sarah Mitchell was someone who had not yet given up. That morning when Sarah came to the desk to sign in, Denise reached under the counter and pulled out an envelope. "This came for you," Denise said, 3 weeks ago. I held it because I wasn't sure you'd be back." Sarah took the envelope. It was cream-colored heavy paper, the kind of envelope that meant someone had paid for the quality. Her name was typed on the front formal and exact Sarah Ann Mitchell. The return address was a law office in Brattleboro, Vermont. She had never been to Vermont. She did not open the envelope at the counter. She took it back to the cot in the women's dormitory where Emma was waiting, and she sat on the thin mattress with the envelope in her lap and looked at it for a full minute before she broke the seal. Inside were 3 pages. The first was a formal letter from a man named Henry Caldwell, attorney at law. It was written in the careful, measured language of someone who had spent decades delivering news to strangers. It said that a woman named Margaret Whitlock had died in September at the age of 87 at her home in Brattleboro, Vermont. Margaret had left no spouse, no children, no siblings. Her closest living relative, identified through probate research, was a great-niece by her late brother Thomas Whitlock, who had left Vermont in 1968 and never returned. That great-niece was Sarah Ann Mitchell, born to Thomas Whitlock's daughter Linda, who had married a man named Robert Mitchell in 1991. Sarah read this twice. Her mother Linda had never spoken about her father's family. Her mother Linda had said on the few occasions when Sarah had asked only that there had been a falling out, that the people in Vermont had not wanted to know them, that there was nothing to be gained from looking back. Her mother had been dead for 9 years. The letter continued. Margaret Whitlock had left behind one asset of substance, an 84-acre property at the end of Sparrow Hill Road in Brattleboro, Vermont. The property had been in the Whitlock family since 1847. It included a 3-story colonial farmhouse, a stone barn, a smokehouse, and a small chapel. The buildings were, the letter said, in the careful legal phrasing of someone obligated to disclose in a state of significant disrepair. The land itself was sound. There was, however, a complication. The property carried an outstanding tax debt of $94,000 accumulated over the last decade of Margaret Whitlock's life as her health and resources had declined. If Sarah wished to claim the inheritance, the debt would need to be addressed within 75 days of the formal opening of probate, which had occurred 2 weeks earlier. If Sarah did not claim the property within that window, it would go to county auction. The second page was a copy of Margaret Whitlock's will, brief and formal, leaving everything to Sarah by name. The third page was a small sealed envelope taped to the back of the will with Sarah's name written on it in a hand she did not recognize. She opened it. Inside was a single brass key, old and heavy, attached to a leather cord. The key had been hand-forged. Along its shaft, in small, careful letters, 2 Latin words had been engraved: Veritas Liberat. Sarah did not know Latin. She would learn 3 days later that the phrase meant "the truth sets free." She would learn many things in the days that followed, but that morning, sitting on a cot in a Baltimore shelter, with her daughter pressed against her side, and a brass key in her palm, she felt something open in her chest that had been closed for a very long time. Not hope. She did not trust hope. Something quieter than hope. Something like the first thin crack of light at the edge of a long closed door. She put the key in her pocket. She put the letter in her coat. She held her daughter closer than she had held her in weeks. She did not know what came next, but for the first time in months, she had a direction. She called Henry Caldwell the next morning from the shelter's phone. He answered on the second ring in the warm and unhurried voice of a man who had practiced law in a small Vermont town for 38 years and had nowhere urgent to be. He confirmed everything in the letter. The inheritance was real. The property was legally hers to claim. The tax debt was substantial, but not insurmountable in his words, for a woman who was willing to make difficult decisions quickly. He asked if she could come to Brattleboro. She said she would find a way. She borrowed bus fare from Denise, who gave it without being asked twice, with the expression of a woman who had seen many people walk toward many uncertain futures, and had learned that the only useful thing to do was to give them what they needed and wish them well. Denise pressed an extra $40 into Sarah's hand. At the door money Sarah knew came from Denise's own pocket, and said only, "Send me a postcard if it works out." Sarah said she would. The bus to Brattleboro took 9 hours and stopped in 11 small towns along the way. The landscape shifted gradually from the density of the city to the wide, indifferent spread of New England in late October. The trees burned through their last colors. The fields gave themselves up to harvest. The sky stretched flat and pale above farmland that had been worked by the same families for 200 years. Emma pressed her nose to the window the entire way. She asked questions about every farm they passed. She asked about silos and tractors and why some barns were red and some were white. She asked about cows and horses and the small clusters of black and white birds that lifted in coordinated flight from the fields as the bus rolled past. Sarah answered every question. The questions were a kind of rope she held onto a line running back to the reason she was doing this. Every answer was a small promise. We are going somewhere. There is a place we are going. I have not run out of answers yet. Henry Caldwell met them at the bus station in a brown sedan that had clearly survived many Vermont winters. He was in his mid-60s, gray-haired, and slightly stooped, with the careful kindness of a man who had watched the small triumphs and small failures of an entire community across the length of his career. He shook Sarah's hand. He crouched and introduced himself to Emma, who examined him with the frank assessment of a child determining whether an adult was worth trusting. Emma extended her hand with great seriousness. Caldwell shook it. "You'll do," he said, with such warmth that Sarah felt something in her chest unclench. He drove them through Brattleboro. The town was small, perhaps 3,000 people arranged along a main street that had clearly resisted modernization with the stubborn dignity of New England towns that had decided somewhere in the last century that they preferred themselves the way they were. A hardware store, a diner, a bakery, a bookstore with hand-painted signs in the window. The green mountains visible at the end of every cross street. The peaks already touched with the first dusting of snow. Caldwell took them to lunch at the diner. He ordered for Emma, without being asked, a grilled cheese and a small bowl of tomato soup, and the waitress brought it without comment, which suggested to Sarah that Caldwell did this often and that the town accommodated him without questions. Over coffee, Caldwell told her about her great-aunt. Margaret Whitlock had been in his telling the most stubborn woman he had ever represented. She had inherited the property at the age of 54, when her own father died, and she had spent the next 33 years living alone in a house she could not afford to maintain, paying property taxes she could barely cover, refusing every offer that came to her door. There had been many offers. "How many?" Sarah asked. "Over the years," Caldwell said, "I'd estimate 27. From developers, from land speculators, from one consortium out of Boston that offered her $2 million in 2003. Sarah set down her cup. $2 million. Cash. No conditions. She turned it down inside of an hour. She came to my office the next morning to make sure I had documented the refusal properly." "Why?" Caldwell looked at her for a long moment. He looked like a man choosing his words with the care of someone who had been waiting for exactly this conversation for a long time. "That," he said finally, "is what I hope you will help me understand. Margaret never gave me a reason. She said only that the land was not for sale and would never be for sale to anyone outside the family. She said she was waiting for the right person." He paused. "I think she meant you." Sarah did not know what to say to that. She drank her coffee. Emma was working on her grilled cheese with the focused intensity of a hungry child, oblivious to the weight of the conversation above her head. Caldwell continued, He told her the practical facts. The tax debt was $94,000. The county had been carrying the debt with increasing impatience. The 75-day window from the opening of probate was now 61 days. After that, the property would go to auction, and the most likely buyer would be a man Caldwell named Richard Hawthorne. Sarah did not know the name. Caldwell explained. Richard Hawthorne was a Vermont state senator. He was 58 years old. He came from one of the oldest families in the state, a family whose money went back to before the Civil War. He had made repeated offers on the Whitlock property over the last 20 years. He had been the man who offered $2 million in 2003. He had increased that offer twice in subsequent decades. Margaret had refused him every time with an intensity that Caldwell described as personal. "She never told you why she hated him?" Sarah asked. "Not in those words. She said only that the land would never go to the Hawthorns. She said it like a vow." Sarah looked out the diner window. Brattleboro was quiet on a Tuesday afternoon. A man walked past with a dog on a leash. A woman crossed the street carrying grocery bags. The town moved at the pace of a place that had never been in a hurry. "I want to see it," Sarah said. "Of course," Caldwell said. "I'll take you now." The road to Sparrow Hill ran north out of Brattleboro for 6 miles, then turned east onto a gravel road that climbed slowly through forest that had grown up over former pasture. The trees were oak and maple and birch, mostly bare now in late October, their fallen leaves thick on the ground. The road narrowed. The canopy closed overhead. Then the trees opened and the farmhouse appeared. It rose from the clearing the way old houses do when they have been waiting for something. 3 stories of weathered clapboard painted white once, and now gone gray with the slow erasure of 177 years of weather. A steep peaked roof of slate missing tiles in several places, but mostly holding the way. The bones of well-built things continued to hold long after lesser construction had given way. A wide front porch with hand-turned posts. A stone chimney at each end of the house, both still standing, both still square. Beyond the house, the stone barn smaller, but solid, its roof intact. The smokehouse small and square, its door fallen off its hinges, but its walls upright. And at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in a stand of cedar trees, a small chapel, no larger than a single room, its white paint almost entirely gone, its single arched window dark. 84 acres spread out beyond the buildings, a long, sloping field that had once been pasture, now reclaimed by goldenrod and young saplings. A stand of mature hardwood that ran up the ridge to the north. A creek visible as a glint of water through the trees. Stone walls half buried in undergrowth marking property lines that had been laid down by hand in the 1840s. Emma got out of the car and stood for a moment very still, looking at the chapel. "Mom," she said quietly, "there's someone in there." Sarah looked at her daughter. Emma was staring at the chapel with the focused, unblinking attention of a child who had seen something that the adults had not. "There's nobody in there, sweetheart," Sarah said gently. "It's been empty for a long time." Emma did not move her gaze. "She's watching us," Emma said. "She's not scary. She's just watching." Sarah crouched down beside her daughter and put a hand on her shoulder. "Who?" "The lady in the dark dress," Emma said. "She has her hair pulled back. She's waiting for us." Sarah felt something cold move along her spine. The woman in the dream. The woman from 2 nights ago in Baltimore, when Sarah had fallen into a half-sleep against the iron gate of a thrift shop. The woman in the long, dark dress, whose face she could not place. The woman who had said very clearly in a voice that did not feel like a dream voice that they were waiting. Sarah looked at the chapel. The arched window was dark. The door was closed. There was no one inside. She stood up slowly. She squeezed Emma's hand. "Let's go inside the house first," she said. "We'll look at the chapel after." Caldwell was watching them with the patient and slightly puzzled expression of a man who had not heard the exchange, but had registered that something had passed between mother and daughter. He led them up the porch steps and unlocked the front door with a key that looked very similar to the one Sarah carried in her pocket. The inside of the farmhouse was a museum of slow, careful living. The front hall ran the length of the house with a wide oak staircase rising along the left wall, the banister hand-carved in a pattern of leaves and small birds. The floors were wide plank pine, dark with age, scuffed in the patterns of 170 years of feet. The walls were horsehair plaster, cracked in places, but intact, painted in faded colors that had been chosen by someone who cared. The parlor on the right held a horsehair sofa, 2 armchairs, a small writing desk, and a fireplace with a mantel of carved walnut. The dining room on the left held a long table that could seat 12, with 8 matching chairs and 4 more pushed against the wall. The kitchen behind the dining room was enormous, with a cast-iron wood stove that took up most of one wall and a stone sink set into a counter built from a single slab of maple. Everything was clean. Sarah noticed this slowly, the way you notice things that are quietly wrong before you understand what is wrong about them. The house had been unoccupied since Margaret Whitlock had been moved to a care facility 11 months earlier. The house should have been thick with dust. The corners should have held cobwebs. The floors should have been gritty underfoot. The floors were swept. The counters were wiped. The dust on the mantel was thin enough that someone had been here within the last week. "Someone has been cleaning," Sarah said. Caldwell nodded slowly. He looked for the first time since she had met him slightly uncomfortable. "A woman from town comes up once a week. Margaret arranged it years ago. She paid in advance through the estate. The arrangement was that the house would be maintained until you arrived." "Until I arrived," Sarah repeated. Margaret left very specific instructions. Sarah turned slowly in the front hall, taking in the house, the careful preservation of it, the silent insistence of a place that had been kept ready for her. On the wall above the writing desk in the parlor, there was a framed photograph. She walked over to it. The photograph was black and white, taken in what looked like the 1970s. It showed two women standing on the front porch of the farmhouse, both in their late 40s or early 50s. One of them was a slender white woman with gray-streaked hair pulled back, who Sarah recognized somehow in the bones of the face as a Whitlock. That had to be Margaret. The other woman was black-dressed in a simple dark dress, her hair pulled back in a low bun. She was looking directly at the camera with an expression that was calm and certain and somehow familiar. It was the woman from Sarah's dream. Sarah stood in front of the photograph for a long time. She did not say anything. Behind her, she could hear Caldwell explaining something to Emma about the wood stove. She could hear Emma asking questions in her bright, curious voice. She could hear the small, ordinary sounds of a house that had been waiting. She thought about a brass key in her pocket. She thought about Latin words she did not understand. She thought about a great aunt she had never met who had refused $2 million and waited 33 years for a stranger she had never seen. She thought with a clarity she had not felt in months that her life had just changed. The sheriff arrived an hour later. Sarah and Emma were sitting on the front porch when his truck came up the gravel road. Caldwell had gone back into town to handle some paperwork and would return for them in the late afternoon. Sarah had been showing Emma the view from the porch, pointing out the creek and the line of the ridge to the north, and the way the light fell across the open field where the goldenrod was going to seed. The truck pulled up next to Caldwell's car. The man who got out was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with the kind of weathered build that suggested a life spent moving rather than sitting. He was in his late 30s. He wore a sheriff's department jacket and a wide-brimmed hat. He carried himself like a man who had spent a long time learning not to startle people. He took off his hat as he approached the porch.
"Ma'am," he said, "I'm Sheriff Daniel Reed. I'm sorry to intrude. Henry Caldwell mentioned you'd be coming up today. I wanted to introduce myself." Sarah stood up. Emma slid behind her, peering around her mother's hip, with the cautious attention of a child evaluating a stranger. "Sarah Mitchell," she said. "This is my daughter, Emma."
Daniel Reed crouched down to Emma's level. He did this without any of the performance that adults usually brought to crouching for children, the overbright voice and the sudden smile. He simply lowered himself so they were eye to eye and held out his hand. "Hello, Emma. I'm Daniel." Emma considered him. Then she came out from behind Sarah and shook his hand with great seriousness. "I'm 7, she said. "That's a very good age," Daniel said. "My friend Tommy at school in Baltimore was 7 too, but we don't go to school there anymore." Daniel nodded gravely. "My son Tommy is 9, he said. "He's a good kid. You might meet him sometime." Emma considered this with the focused attention of a child making an important assessment. "Okay," she said. Daniel stood up. He turned to Sarah. "I'm not here in any official capacity," he said. "Just neighborly. Your great-aunt Margaret was friends with my father before he passed. I've been keeping an eye on the property since she went into the care facility last year." Sarah nodded. She did not yet know what to do with kindness when it was offered without conditions. She had spent 8 months in a world where every interaction had been a transaction. "Thank you," she said. "I wanted to mention something," Daniel said. He looked uncomfortable for a moment, the way a man looks when he is about to deliver information he is not sure he is supposed to deliver. "There's a man named Richard Hawthorne who's going to come up here, probably within the next few days. He's a state senator. He's been wanting this land for a long time. He'll be very polite. He'll make you an offer that sounds good." He paused. "Margaret asked me before she went into the facility to tell whoever inherited the property that this land was never to be sold to the Hawthorns. Not for any price. She said you should know that before he came up the road." Sarah looked at him. "Did she say why?" Daniel hesitated. "She said only that the Hawthorns had taken enough already. I never knew what she meant, but she said it like she meant it." Sarah looked out across the field. The light was turning gold in the late afternoon, the way Vermont light turned in October, with the particular clarity of a place where the air was clean and the horizons were close. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Daniel nodded. He looked at Emma. He looked at Sarah. He seemed about to say something else and then decided against it. "You have my number through Henry," he said. "If anything happens up here that doesn't feel right, you call me, day or night." Sarah felt for the first time in a very long time the unfamiliar sensation of being looked at by a man who was not assessing what he could get from her. She did not know what to do with the feeling. She nodded. Daniel put his hat back on. He touched the brim. He walked back to his truck. He drove away down the gravel road, the dust rising behind him in the slanted afternoon light. Emma watched him go. "Mom," she said, "I think he's a good one." Sarah looked down at her daughter. "You think so?" Emma nodded with the absolute certainty of a child who had not yet learned to second-guess her instincts. "He looks at you like he can see you," she said. "Some people don't. He does." Sarah did not know what to say to that. She held her daughter's hand instead, and they watched the dust settle on the road, and the light continued to gold across the field. And somewhere in the trees, a single bird called once, and then went quiet, and the house behind them held its breath the way it had been holding its breath for 33 years waiting. That night they slept in the parlor. Caldwell had returned with a load of supplies that Sarah had not asked for and could not afford. Firewood, 2 heavy quilts from the linen closet upstairs, which he had aired out himself, a small bag of groceries from the market in town, a box of matches and a kerosene lamp because the electricity to the house had been shut off years ago, and the only working heat source was the parlor fireplace. He had refused payment. "I knew Margaret for 36 years, he had said. "She would have wanted you taken care of on your first night. Consider it the last thing I do for her." Sarah had not argued. She built a fire with hands that remembered somehow how to build fires, though she could not remember the last time she had needed to. She made a bed of quilts on the parlor floor for herself and Emma. She heated water on the wood stove in the kitchen which Caldwell had shown her how to use, and made hot chocolate for Emma from a packet he had included in the groceries. Emma drank her hot chocolate, sitting cross-legged on the quilt watching the fire. "Mom," she said. "Yes, baby, the lady in the chapel. She wants us to look for something." Sarah turned to look at her daughter. Emma was not looking at her. Emma was looking at the fire, her face calm and untroubled with the expression of a child reporting something obvious. "Look for what? I don't know yet. She just says we have to look under the floor." "Under what floor, sweetheart?" "In the chapel." Sarah was quiet for a moment. She watched the fire. She thought about the photograph on the parlor wall, and the woman in the long, dark dress and the brass key in her pocket with 2 Latin words on it that meant the truth sets free. "Em," she said carefully, "are you sure you're seeing the lady, not just imagining her?" Emma turned and looked at her mother. Her face was perfectly serious. "Mom," she said with the patient exasperation of a child explaining something to an adult who refused to understand, "I'm not making it up. She's just there. She's been there a long time. She's tired." Sarah did not push it further. She held her daughter as Emma drifted off to sleep beside her on the quilts, the firelight moving on the walls of a parlor that had not seen a child in 50 years. She thought about how strange life was, how the world could be one thing one week and another thing the next. How she had been counting $287 on a sidewalk 5 days ago and was now lying in a house she somehow owned, in a state she had never visited, with a daughter who was seeing dead women in a chapel and a tax bill she could not pay and a brass key in her pocket. She thought about Margaret Whitlock, who had refused $2 million and waited 33 years. She thought about the woman in the dark dress. She thought just before she fell asleep that whatever she was about to find, she was going to find it. Not because she had a choice, because something in her had decided sometime between Baltimore and Brattleboro that running was no longer an option, that this was the place she was going to stand, that whatever this house was holding, she had come here to find out. She slept. She did not dream. In the morning, when she woke, Emma was already up. The child was standing at the parlor window looking out at the chapel. "Mom," Emma said without turning. "It's time." Sarah got up. She put on her coat. She put the brass key in her pocket. She took her daughter's hand. They walked across the yard in the cold, early light, the grass crunching under their feet, frost still silver on the open ground. The chapel was 20 yards from the main house, set apart in the stand of cedar, a small white building no larger than a single room. The door was unlocked. Sarah pushed it open. The hinges were silent. Someone had oiled them recently. Inside the chapel was empty. 4 wooden pews along the side walls. A small altar at the far end. Just a plain wooden table. A single arched window above the altar that faced east, where the morning light was now coming through in a long, slanted shaft that fell across the wooden floor. The floor was made of square-cut stone, the kind of stone that had been quarried locally in the 1840s and laid by hand. The stones were each about a foot square. They were dark with age, smooth in the centers, where decades of feet had passed across them, rougher at the edges. Emma walked directly to a stone 3 feet in front of the altar. She pointed at it. "Here," she said. Sarah crouched down. She ran her fingers along the edge of the stone. The mortar between this stone and its neighbors was crumbling looser than the mortar elsewhere. She pressed her palm flat against the stone. It rocked slightly. It was not fixed. She found a small iron poker leaning against the wall by the altar, the kind of poker that might once have been used to stir the coals in the small chapel stove. She wedged it into the gap at the edge of the stone and levered upward. The stone lifted. Beneath it, set into a small cavity in the foundation, wrapped in oiled leather that had been carefully preserved against time and weather, was a book. Sarah pulled it out. The leather wrapping was tied with a cord that came apart in her hands. Inside the leather was a journal bound in dark calf, the binding intact, the pages yellowed but not brittle. On the front cover, in a careful copperplate hand, was a name and a date. Eliza Whitlock, 1859. Sarah opened the journal carefully. The first page bore an inscription in the same hand written in ink that had faded to the color of old tea. This book contains the secret of Sparrow Hill and the names of those we have helped and the location of the things we keep for them until they come back. If you have found this book, you are of our blood, and you are bound by our promise. The truth sets free. So shall we be. Sarah looked up. Emma was standing very still beside her, looking at the open page, her small face calm and certain. Above them, in the slanting light from the arched east window, the dust hung suspended in the still air of a chapel that had been keeping a secret for 165 years, waiting for someone to come back for it. Sarah closed the journal slowly. She put it inside her coat against her ribs in the place where the letter from Henry Caldwell had ridden for the last 4 days. She took her daughter's hand. She walked out of the chapel and into the morning, and she did not yet know what she had found. But she knew with the same wordless certainty that had been growing in her since Baltimore, that her life had just turned a corner from which there would be no returning. Somewhere down the road from town, a state senator named Richard Hawthorne was already preparing to drive up to Sparrow Hill. He was 30 miles away. He was coming. Sarah read the journal that morning at the kitchen table while Emma sat across from her drawing pictures of the chapel on the back of an envelope. The cast-iron stove threw a steady warmth into the room. The journal lay open between them in a long shaft of late October sunlight that came through the window above the stone sink. Dust motes turning slowly in the air, the way dust motes turn when a house has been quiet for a long time. Eliza Whitlock had written in a careful, deliberate hand. Her sentences were short. Her observations were precise. Sarah understood within the first 3 pages the kind of woman who measured her words because she lived in a time when the wrong words written down could cost lives. The Whitlock family had built the house in 1847. They were abolitionists. They were Quakers originally, though by Eliza's time the family had drifted from the meeting house. They had built the chapel themselves by hand in the year the house was completed, and from the beginning it had served a purpose that was not what the neighbors believed it to serve. It was a station on the Underground Railroad. Eliza wrote that her father had begun the work in 1849. He had a particular hatred for the institution of slavery, born of a trip to Charleston in his youth, when he had watched at the age of 16 a slave auction in a public square. He had come home and told his own father that he could not live in a country that permitted such a thing without doing what he could against it. By the time Eliza was old enough to understand, the family was running between 4 and 12 people a year through Sparrow Hill, hiding them in the cellar of the chapel, feeding them, clothing them, moving them north toward Canada along a chain of stations that ran up through Vermont and into Quebec. The work continued through the 1850s. It continued into the war. In the spring of 1864, Eliza wrote 12 people arrived at Sparrow Hill in a single night. They came from a plantation in southern Virginia owned by a family named Hawthorne. Sarah set the journal down for a moment when she read the name. She read it twice. She thought about the man who would be coming up the road within days, the senator whose family Margaret Whitlock had said had taken enough already. She picked up the journal and kept reading. The 12 people had escaped together. Their leader was a man named Solomon, whom Eliza described with evident respect. Solomon was perhaps 40 years old. He had been the head of the household staff in the Hawthorne plantation, trusted with the keys to the silver cabinet and the wine cellar and the upstairs rooms. He had used that trust to plan the escape for 2 years. When they had come, they had not come empty-handed. Eliza was careful in what she wrote. She did not in those early pages name what Solomon and his people had brought with them. She said only that they carried something that did not belong to them by ownership, but belonged to them by right, that they had taken what was owed to them for the years of their lives that had been stolen, and that they intended to deliver it onward when the time was right. What that something was, Eliza did not yet say. She wrote that the 12 people had stayed at Sparrow Hill for 6 weeks. They had been hidden in the chapel cellar and in the cellar of the main house. They had been fed at Eliza's family's table in the kitchen, where Sarah was now sitting. They had been clothed in spare garments and given what money the Whitlocks could spare. When they left behind the thing they had carried. They could not take it onward. It was too heavy. It was too visible. They could not move it across the Canadian border without losing everything else. They asked the Whitlocks to keep it for them to hold it in trust until they or their descendants could come back to claim it. Eliza's father agreed. The thing was buried, she wrote, in a place that only the family would know. The map was kept here in this journal on a page that would be revealed only to a descendant who had found the journal and could be trusted to honor the promise. The promise was simple. The thing would be returned when the people came back for it. If they did not come back, their children would. If their children did not come, their grandchildren. The Whitlocks would keep it until then. The promise was binding. The promise had now been kept for 160 years. Sarah closed the journal carefully. She sat in the kitchen of a house that had been waiting for her, and she felt the weight of what she had inherited settle onto her shoulders like a heavy coat that had been hanging on a peg for a very long time and had now been taken down and offered to her, and she understood that there was no question of whether she would put it on. The coat had been measured for her. The coat fit. Emma was watching her. "Mom," Emma said, "you look like you understand now." "I think I do, baby." "What did the lady want us to find?" Sarah looked at her daughter. She thought about how much to say. She had spent the last 3 years protecting Emma from too much truth, and she had also spent the last 3 years watching Emma absorb truths anyway, the way children always did, through the small gaps that adults thought they had closed. "Em," she said, "I think there are some people who lost something a long time ago, and I think Aunt Margaret was keeping it for them, and I think she wants us to find them and give it back." Emma considered this. "That's a good thing to do," she said. "Yes," Sarah said. "It is." She drove into town that afternoon in Margaret's old truck, which Caldwell had told her was hers now, along with everything else, and which started on the 3rd try in the way of old trucks that had been sitting too long. Emma sat beside her in the passenger seat with a seriousness that suggested she understood the importance of the errand without needing to be told what it was. Sarah went to the Brattleboro Historical Society. The society occupied a narrow brick building on a side street off Main Street, 2 doors down from the bakery. The door had a brass bell that rang when it opened. Inside, the front room was crowded with display cases and bookshelves and the accumulated archival material of a small Vermont town that took its own history seriously. A woman looked up from behind a desk at the back. She was perhaps 55 years old. She had reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, gray hair cut short, and the alert and slightly impatient expression of a person who had been waiting for an interruption and had decided to make use of it when it came. "Can I help you?" she said. "I'm looking for someone named Patricia Brooks." The woman looked at Sarah for a long moment. Her eyes moved to Emma, who was standing beside her mother holding her hand. Her eyes came back to Sarah. "You're Margaret Whitlock's great-niece," she said. It was not a question. "How did you know?" "Henry Caldwell called me an hour ago. He thought you might come by. I'm Patricia." She stood up. She came around the desk. She was shorter than Sarah had expected, compact, and efficient in her movements. She looked at Sarah with an intensity that was not unfriendly, but was unmistakable. "I have been waiting 8 years to have this conversation with someone," Patricia said. Margaret would never have it with me. I am going to assume from the fact that you have come here on your second day in Vermont that you have already found something at the house that has led you to ask questions you did not have when you arrived. Sarah looked at her. Yes, she said. Patricia nodded once the way a person nods when a hypothesis has been confirmed. Come in the back, she said. Bring the child. I have cookies. The back room of the Historical Society was where the real work happened. It was lined floor to ceiling with filing cabinets and map drawers. A long oak table dominated the center, currently covered with photographs and documents arranged in a careful research pattern that someone had clearly been working on for a long time. A coffee maker bubbled quietly in one corner. Patricia gave Emma a cookie and a small stool by the table, and then turned to Sarah with the focused attention of a professional whose subject of expertise had just walked through her door. What did you find? Patricia asked. Sarah hesitated for only a moment. She had not yet decided whether to trust this woman. She had not yet decided how much of the journal to share. But she looked at the careful research arranged on the table. The photographs of the Whitlock house at various points in its history. The hand-drawn maps of Sparrow Hill Road. The printed pages of what looked like census records and land deeds. And she understood that Patricia Brooks had been doing the work of remembering this house for years, without anyone's permission and at no one's expense. She was a person who had earned trust by showing up for it. Sarah pulled the journal out of her bag. She did not let Patricia hold it. She opened it on the table herself and turned to the inscription page. Patricia read it. Her face did not change in any obvious way, but Sarah saw the small physical signs of a person processing information at high speed. Her shoulders shifted. Her breath caught and then released. Her hand came up to her mouth and then went down again. She looked at Sarah. Underground Railroad, she said. Yes. How many entries? Years' worth. I haven't read it all yet. Patricia sat down slowly. She took off her reading glasses, polished them on the hem of her sweater, and put them back on. I have been arguing for 15 years, she said, that the Whitlock house was a station. I have had no proof. I have had circumstantial evidence and family stories and a few suggestive notations in town records, but nothing definitive. Your great-aunt would not allow me to research the property. She said the house was a private matter. I respected her wishes. I have spent 15 years building a case that I could not prove. She paused. And now you have walked into my office on your second day in Vermont with the proof in your hand. There's more, Sarah said. She told Patricia what she had read so far. She told her about the 12 people who had come from Virginia in 1864. She told her about Solomon. She told her, watching Patricia's face carefully, that the 12 people had come from a plantation owned by a family named Hawthorne. Patricia went very still. Hawthorne, she said. Yes. The same Hawthorns. Yes. Patricia sat back in her chair. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way people do when they are organizing a great deal of information at once. "Sarah," she said, "I need to tell you something that I have not been able to tell anyone because I could not prove it. I am going to tell you now because I think you need to know it, and because I think between what I know and what is in that journal, we may finally be able to prove something that has been buried for 160 years. She got up. She went to a filing cabinet against the wall and pulled out a folder. She brought it back to the table and set it down. In April of 1864, she said, the Confederate treasury in Richmond was robbed. Sarah felt the room go still around her. It was during the chaos of the last year of the war, Patricia continued. Richmond was under siege. The Confederate government was preparing to evacuate. There was gold being moved out of the city in stages to various secondary depositories. One of those shipments, a wagon train of approximately 2 tons of gold bullion, disappeared somewhere south of the city on the night of April 19th. The escort was killed. The gold was never recovered. Patricia opened the folder. She pulled out a copy of a newspaper article from May of 1864. The headline still legible: Confederate gold vanished. Inquiry continues. The Confederate government conducted an inquiry, Patricia said. They concluded that the gold had been taken by Union sympathizers. They never identified the perpetrators. After the war ended, the United States government conducted its own inquiry. They could not find the gold either. The case has been an open historical mystery for 160 years. She looked at Sarah. There has always been a persistent rumor, she said carefully, that the gold was taken by escaped slaves. The rumor has never been proven. There is no documentation. There are no names. There is only the persistent story that a group of enslaved people from a single plantation escaped on the same night the gold disappeared, traveled north together, and that the gold went with them. Patricia tapped the folder. The plantation in the rumor is the Hawthorne plantation. Sarah looked at the article. She looked at Patricia. She looked at the journal on the table with its faded ink and its careful copperplate hand and its inscription about a promise that the Whitlocks had kept for 160 years. Patricia, she said, I think we have just proven the rumor. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. I think so too, she said. They were still sitting at the table an hour later, deep in the journal, deep in the cross-referencing of dates and names when the bell at the front door rang. Patricia looked up sharply. I locked that door, she said. Sarah felt something cold move down her spine. Footsteps came across the front room of the Historical Society. They were measured and unhurried, the footsteps of a man who knew he was welcome in any room he chose to enter. He appeared in the doorway of the back room. He was in his late 50s, perhaps 60. He was tall and broad, with silver hair cut short, and the smooth, slightly tanned face of a man who spent his time in places where the climate was controlled. He wore a charcoal wool overcoat and a maroon scarf. He carried himself with the easy, slightly amused authority of a man who had been in elected office long enough to have stopped noticing the deference he received. He smiled.
"Ms. Mitchell,"
He said.
"forgive the intrusion. I thought I might find you here. I'm Richard Hawthorne."
Patricia stood up. "Senator," she said. Her voice was tight. "This is a private research session. I'd appreciate it if you would wait at the front desk." "Of course, Patricia. I won't intrude on your work. I simply wanted to introduce myself to our newest neighbor and offer my congratulations on her inheritance." He looked at Sarah. His eyes moved briefly to the table. He saw the journal. He saw the folder of newspaper articles. He saw Sarah was certain exactly enough to understand what was being researched. His expression did not change.
"Ms. Mitchell,"
He said.
"when you have a free moment, I'd very much like to take you to lunch. There are some matters concerning the Sparrow Hill property that I think you should hear about from me directly, rather than from secondary sources. I've known your great-aunt for many years, and there's a history here that I think you deserve to understand."
Sarah did not stand up. She looked at him. She thought about a journal that had been hidden under a stone in a chapel for 160 years. She thought about her daughter, who had said the lady in the chapel was tired. She thought about a great aunt she had never met, who had said this land would never go to the Hawthorns. "I'm not available for lunch today, Senator," she said. Her voice was level. "I'm settling in."
"Of course,"
Hawthorne said. "Tomorrow then, or whenever is convenient. I'll be in touch through Mr. Caldwell if I have anything to discuss." The smile flickered, just for a moment. The polite mask held, but something underneath it shifted.
"Of course,"
Hawthorne said again.
"I want you to know, Ms. Mitchell, that I'm here as a resource. The property comes with significant complications. The tax debt alone is, I understand, substantial. There are mechanisms by which the situation can be resolved cleanly and to your benefit. I would hate to see you find yourself overwhelmed by something you weren't prepared for."
He paused.
"Your great-aunt was a stubborn woman. I don't mean that unkindly. She made decisions near the end that I'm not sure she would have made with better counsel. I hope you'll allow yourself the benefit of counsel that she did not."
Sarah felt Emma move closer to her side. She felt her daughter's small hand slip into hers. "Thank you for the offer, Senator," Sarah said. "I have counsel. Mr. Caldwell is handling my affairs."
"Henry is a fine lawyer for a small Vermont practice,"
Hawthorne said. The condescension was so smooth that it was barely visible.
"For matters of this scale, however, you may find that broader expertise would serve you. My office can recommend several excellent firms in Boston."
"I'll keep that in mind." He looked at her for one more moment. Then he nodded the small, precise nod of a man who had made an offer and registered the refusal and was filing the information for later use.
"Welcome to Vermont, Miss Mitchell. I hope your time here is everything you hope for."
He turned and walked out.
The bell at the front door rang again as he left. Patricia waited until they heard his car start in the street outside. Then she sat down heavily in her chair. "He knows?" she said. "How could he know? He's known something his whole life. His family has always known something. I don't know what they were told or what they suspect. But he has wanted this land for 20 years, and Margaret refused him every time. And now you have walked into my office with a journal that mentions his family by name, and he showed up within hours." She looked at Sarah. "Be careful," she said. "I don't know what he's willing to do. I have spent 15 years arguing with that man over historical designations and zoning issues, and 3 different attempts he has made to alter the boundaries of the property next to yours. He is not a man who is used to losing, and he is not going to lose this quietly." Sarah looked down at Emma. Emma was watching the door where Hawthorne had stood. Her small face calm, her eyes thoughtful. "Mom," Emma said quietly, "he had a shadow behind him. Did you see it?" Sarah crouched down. She held her daughter's shoulders.
"What kind of shadow, Em?"
Emma frowned, working out how to explain something that had no easy words.
"Like a long dark thing standing behind him, like it was hanging on him. The lady in the chapel doesn't have that. Sheriff Daniel doesn't have that. But that man does." Sarah did not know what to say to that.
She held her daughter for a moment. Then she stood up. She turned to Patricia. "I have 60 days, she said. 60 days to pay $94,000 in tax debt, or this property goes to county auction. If it goes to auction, he will buy it. He will have access to everything that is on that land. Whatever the 12 people left behind, whatever Solomon and his people brought from Virginia, it will end up in the hands of the family they took it from." Patricia nodded slowly. "What do you need?" she asked. "I need to know what's possible. Grants, historical designations, anything that buys me time or money or both." "I can start the paperwork tonight. And I need to find the descendants of the 12 people, Solomon, the others, whoever they were. I need to find them before Hawthorne does, because right now I am the only thing standing between him and what their ancestors left behind." Patricia looked at her for a long moment. "Sarah," she said, "do you understand what you're taking on? I'm starting to. This is not just a property dispute. This is a piece of American history that has been buried for 160 years. If we do this right, we are returning something to people whose ancestors were owned by a family whose descendants still hold power in this state. If we do this wrong, we are stealing it twice." "I know. And if Senator Hawthorne decides to push back hard, he can make your life very difficult." Sarah looked at her. She thought about Baltimore. She thought about $287 on a cardboard box. She thought about a brass key in her pocket that meant the truth sets free. "He doesn't know what difficult looks like," she said.
She did not say it boastfully. She said it the way a person stated a fact about themselves that they had earned the right to state. Patricia almost smiled. "All right," she said. "Let's get to work." She worked. For the next 3 weeks, Sarah did not sleep more than 5 hours a night. She got Emma enrolled in the elementary school in town, where a kind woman named Mrs. Halloran took the child under her wing immediately, and where Emma quickly attached herself to a quiet 9-year-old boy named Tommy, who turned out to be Daniel Reed's son. She found part-time work at the bakery on Main Street 4 hours a day, making barely enough to cover groceries and gas for the truck. She came home each afternoon and worked on the journal. She read every page. She copied the names of the 12 people in Solomon's group into a notebook. She copied the dates, the place names, the small details of where the group had come from and what they had been called. She gave the names to Patricia, who began running them through genealogical databases and African American historical archives, and the records of churches in the towns along the original Underground Railroad routes north into Canada. The descendants began to surface slowly. A family in Atlanta named Coleman, the great-great-great-grandchildren of Solomon, who had made it to Canada in 1864, and whose son had returned to the United States in the 1880s and settled in Georgia. A reverend in their family line was still alive, a man named James Coleman, 67 years old, who had been pastoring the same church in Atlanta for 30 years. A family in Detroit. A family in Toronto. A family that had stayed in Vermont, in fact, in a town 50 miles north. Descendants of one of the women in Solomon's group who had married a free black man in the post-war years and never gone home to Virginia. Patricia worked the records. Sarah worked the journal. Caldwell worked the legal questions. Daniel Reed kept an eye on the property, drove up the road twice a day on his patrols, and noticed twice in the first week that an unfamiliar truck had been parked at the end of Sparrow Hill Road for several hours, both times during daylight. Both times leaving when Daniel's patrol vehicle came into view. He told Sarah. "Hawthorne's people," she asked. "I can't prove it, but I'd bet on it." It was on the 4th night that someone tried to enter the house. Sarah woke at 3 in the morning to a sound she did not at first recognize. Emma was sleeping in the room next to hers, a small bedroom they had decided would be hers, on the 2nd floor of the farmhouse, with a window that looked east across the field. Sarah had taken the larger bedroom across the hall. The sound was a soft, careful pressure against the front door downstairs. Sarah lay very still in the dark. She listened. The pressure came again. Then the unmistakable click of someone trying the door handle. She slid out of bed soundlessly. She had been a woman in a shelter for 8 months. She had learned to wake fully and instantly and silently. She moved to the door of her bedroom and looked across the hall at Emma's room, where the door was closed, where her daughter was sleeping. She went to the top of the stairs. From the landing, she could see the front door. The handle was being tried again. Not violently, carefully. The way a person turns a doorknob when they want to know if it is locked, but do not want anyone inside to hear them. Sarah picked up the iron poker that she had left at the top of the stairs 3 nights earlier, when she had begun to understand the situation she was in. She moved to the window beside the stairs. She looked out. There was a man on the porch. He was tall. He wore dark clothes. He had a flashlight that he was not using. His face was turned away from her toward the door. Sarah pulled out her phone. She called Daniel Reed. He answered on the second ring, his voice level, and immediately awake, the voice of a man whose job required him to be reachable at 3 a.m, and who had long ago learned to come awake fully on the first sound. Sarah. There's a man on my porch trying to get into the house.
I'm on my way. Stay upstairs. Don't open the door under any circumstances.
She heard him moving in the background. Boots on a floor. A truck door opening.
2 minutes,
he said. She stayed at the window. The man on the porch tried the handle one more time. Then he turned slowly and looked up at the house. Sarah pulled back from the window before he could see her. When she looked again, he was walking down the porch steps. He moved to the side of the house and disappeared around the corner toward the chapel. She could hear faintly the sound of his footsteps on the frost-stiff grass. She moved to the back of the house. She looked out the bedroom window that faced the chapel. The man was at the chapel door. He was trying it. The door was not locked. He pushed it open and went inside, with the flashlight finally on a single beam moving across the dark interior. Sarah stood at the window with the poker in her hand and watched the light move across the chapel. She thought about the stone in front of the altar. She thought about whether she had put it back exactly as she had found it. She thought about what would happen if the man saw that one stone sat slightly higher than its neighbors, that the mortar had been recently disturbed, that something had been taken from beneath it. The flashlight beam was sweeping the floor. It paused. It came back. It paused again on the stone. Sarah's grip tightened on the poker. Then headlights came up the gravel road fast and bright, and the flashlight in the chapel went off. And a moment later, a dark shape came running out of the chapel and into the trees behind the property, moving with the speed of a man who had been prepared to leave at a moment's notice. Daniel Reed's truck pulled up in front of the house. Sarah went down the stairs. She unlocked the door. Daniel was already on the porch with his hand on his service weapon. "He ran into the woods behind the chapel," she said. Daniel nodded once. He went around the house. He was gone for perhaps 10 minutes. When he came back, he was alone, but he had a small object in his hand, which he showed to Sarah in the porch light. It was a cigarette butt.
He stood by the chapel for a few minutes before he came up to the house, Daniel said. He smoked while he watched. Then he came up. He's gone now. He went out through the woods to the road below, probably parked there. Did you see his face? No, but Sarah. He held up the cigarette butt. This is a specific brand. They're imported, not common in Vermont. The closest place I know of that sells them is a tobacco shop in Montpelier. I happen to know who buys them there because I asked the owner once years ago on a different case. They're bought by exactly one man in this state on a regular basis." He looked at her. "They're bought by Senator Hawthorne's chief of staff." Sarah did not say anything. She looked out at the dark line of trees behind the chapel at the place where a man had stood for half an hour watching her house, where he had then come up the porch steps and tried the handle, where he had then gone into the chapel and stopped his flashlight on the very stone under which she had found the journal 3 weeks earlier. She thought, "He is not playing." She thought, "I am not playing either." Daniel was watching her face. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I think you and Emma should come stay with me and Tommy for a few days. We have a spare room. The house is locked at night. I'd feel better." She looked at him. She had known him for 3 weeks. He had been kind to her daughter. He had checked on the property without being asked. He had answered the phone at 3 in the morning and arrived in less than 4 minutes. He had not asked for anything in return for any of these things. "I can't leave the house, Daniel," she said. "If they think I'm gone, they'll come back and tear it apart looking for what I have." He nodded slowly. He understood. "Then I'm going to be here at night," he said, "until this is over. I'll sleep in the parlor. I won't be in your way." "Daniel?" "Sarah, I'm not asking. I'm telling you what I'm doing." She looked at him in the porch light. He was a tall man in a sheriff's department jacket with snow beginning to fall in small, dry flakes around them. The first real snow of the season, and he was looking at her with the kind of steady, uncomplicated determination that she had not seen in a man in many years, and she did not know what to do with it. She nodded. "Thank you," she said. He nodded back. He stayed in the parlor that night. He slept on the horsehair sofa with a blanket Sarah had given him and his service weapon on the small side table within arm's reach. He was up before dawn. He made coffee in the kitchen. He took a cup up to Sarah's bedroom door and knocked softly and said, "It's just me," and left the cup on the floor outside her door because he understood, without having to be told, that a woman who had been alone for a long time needed her own bedroom to remain her own. He did this every night for the next 11 nights. Emma began to call him Sheriff Daniel and to climb into his lap in the parlor in the evenings when he came off shift, and to ask him questions about being a sheriff and what his son Tommy liked, and whether Tommy might come visit and meet Emma's chicken, which was an imaginary chicken Emma had decided lived in the stone barn behind the house and was named Beatrice. Daniel answered every question with the same patient seriousness he had shown the first day they met. On the 12th day, Patricia called. Sarah was at the kitchen table working through the last pages of the journal. She had been saving them. She did not entirely know why. She had felt working through the earlier pages that the journal had been written by a woman who knew that whoever read it last would need to be ready for what was at the end. She had felt that she needed to be ready before she finished it. She picked up the phone. "Sarah," Patricia said, Her voice was tight with controlled excitement. I need you to come to the Historical Society. Now, bring Emma. Bring the journal. I have found something I think you need to see. Sarah was at the Historical Society in 20 minutes. Patricia met her at the door. She was holding a manila folder. She did not speak in the front room. She led Sarah and Emma into the back room and closed the door. She set the folder on the table. I've been cross-referencing the names from the journal against every database I have access to, she said. I've been looking for descendants. That's been the priority. But 2 days ago, I started looking at something else. I started looking at the Hawthorne family. She opened the folder. The Hawthorne plantation in Virginia was owned by a man named Augustus Hawthorne. He was Senator Richard Hawthorne's great-great-great-grandfather. After the war, the plantation collapsed. Augustus lost most of his fortune. He moved north in 1867 and settled in Vermont, which is how the Hawthornes ended up in this state. She pulled out a document. In 1869, Augustus Hawthorne hired 3 men through a private agency in New York. The agency specialized in what was politely called recovery work. The men were sent to track down a group of escaped slaves who had stolen what Augustus described in his hiring documents as personal property of considerable value. She looked at Sarah. The hiring documents are in the New York Historical Society archives. They've been there since 1934, when the agency went out of business and donated its records. They are not classified. They are simply not well indexed. I found them yesterday afternoon. She pulled out another document. The 3 men succeeded in locating 4 members of the original group of 12 in 3 different cities between 1869 and 1872. All 4 were murdered. The hiring documents include payment records for what is described as services rendered. Patricia's voice had gone very quiet. Augustus Hawthorne paid to have those people killed. Sarah, the senator's family. They didn't just lose property. They hunted those people down and killed them when they couldn't get it back. Sarah sat down slowly. She looked at the documents. She looked at Patricia. She looked finally at Emma, who was sitting on the small stool by the table, holding a cookie and listening with the calm attention of a child who had decided some weeks ago that the conversations the adults around her were having were important enough to listen to without interrupting. The senator knows this, Sarah said. He has to. It's family history. It's the kind of thing you find out at some point if you grow up in that family. And he wants the rest of what they took. He has wanted it his whole life. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Patricia, where did they bury it? Patricia smiled. It was a small, tight smile, the smile of a person who had been working toward this question for a very long time. I was hoping you would ask me that. I've been waiting for you to finish the journal. Sarah pulled the journal out of her bag. She set it on the table. Patricia opened it carefully. She turned to the back. The last 20 pages had been sewn together, the binding holding them shut as a single block. They could only be separated by cutting the thread. This is the part Eliza didn't want anyone to find, Patricia said, unless they had read the rest of the journal first.
unless they understood what they were taking on. Sarah took a small pair of scissors from her bag. She cut the thread carefully. The pages opened. The first page was a hand-drawn map. It showed Sparrow Hill. It showed the farmhouse and the chapel and the stone barn. It showed the creek and the line of the ridge. It showed at the eastern edge of the property, in a stand of trees that Sarah recognized because she had walked past it many times in the last 3 weeks, a single large oak tree marked with a small, careful X. Beside the oak, in Eliza Whitlock's careful copperplate hand, was a single word, here. The page underneath was a key to the map. It described the oak tree. It said the tree had been planted in 1798 by Eliza's grandfather. It said the tree had been chosen because it was the oldest thing on the property and would be the easiest to find 100 years later. 200 years later, however long it took for someone to come back. The page underneath that was an inventory. The inventory was 3 columns. The first column listed crates. There were 43 of them. The second column listed what each crate contained. The third column listed weight. Crates 1 through 41 contained gold. Crate 42 contained, according to Eliza's hand, papers of importance to the cause. Crate 43 contained in a separate notation at the bottom of the page written in different ink, and apparently added at a later date, the things Solomon left for his children's children to find. Sarah looked at the inventory. Patricia looked at it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Patricia said very quietly, 41 crates of gold, Sarah. That's the Richmond shipment. That's all of it. Sarah looked at Emma. Emma was on the stool watching them both with her calm, serious face. And crate 43, Sarah said. I don't know, Patricia said. I don't know what it is. Outside the window of the Historical Society, snow had begun to fall again, fine and steady, the second snow of November. The light in the back room had gone soft and gray. Somewhere in town, a clock on a church tower struck 4. Sarah looked at the map. She looked at the X under the old oak tree. She thought about Solomon, who had been 40 years old in 1864, who had held the keys to a wine cellar, who had planned the escape of 12 people over 2 years, who had carried something north from Virginia that did not belong to him by ownership, but belonged to him by right. She thought about what he might have buried in a separate crate at the bottom of a hole in Vermont, marked in different ink as something for his children's children to find. She thought, I am going to dig that up. I am going to dig it up tonight. She thought, I am going to do it before Senator Hawthorne realizes how close he is to losing. She stood up. Patricia, she said, I need to call Daniel. They went out to the oak tree just after midnight. The snow had stopped falling by then, leaving the ground silver under a half moon that came and went behind a sky of moving clouds. Sarah carried a long-handled shovel that had been in the stone barn since Margaret Whitlock's time. Daniel Reed carried a heavy iron pry bar and a rolled tarp and a battery-powered work lamp that threw a wide cone of white light when he set it down beside the trunk of the tree. Patricia Brooks carried the journal, the map, and a digital camera. Emma was at the Coleman house in town. Mrs. Halloran, the kindly school teacher who had taken to Emma in the first week, had agreed to keep her for the night without asking why. The oak was enormous. It stood at the eastern edge of the property on a small rise above the creek, in a clearing that the surrounding forest had grown up around, but never quite consumed. Its trunk was over 6 feet across at the base. Its lower branches reached out 20 feet in every direction. It had been planted in 1798 by a man whose name Sarah did not know, who had chosen this spot for reasons he had never written down, and the tree had been waiting 228 years for someone to come back for what was buried at its roots. Daniel paced the ground for several minutes with the work lamp held low, looking for any sign of disturbance. "Recent enough that we'd see it?" Sarah asked. "Probably not. If they buried it deep in 1864 and never came back, the ground would have settled and reforested completely by now. We're looking for nothing. We're going to have to find it the hard way." Patricia held up the map. She turned it to align with the actual position of the oak. "The X is on the south side of the trunk," she said. Eliza was specific. "South side between the tree and the creek." Daniel knelt down. He used the pry bar to test the soil along the south side of the trunk, working in a slow, careful arc. The ground was frozen at the surface, but only at the surface. Under the first inch of frost, the earth gave way more easily, dark loam threaded with the roots of the great tree. It took them 2 hours to find the first edge of wood. Daniel had been digging at a shallow angle, watching for anything that did not match the texture of root or stone, when his shovel made a sound that was distinctly not earth. It was a low, dull sound, the sound of metal meeting wood that had been compressed for a long time. He stopped. Sarah came to stand beside him. She held the work lamp. The wood was about 3 feet down. It was the corner of a crate, dark with the slow staining of a century and a half underground, but still solid, still recognizably wood. Daniel cleared the dirt away with his hands. The crate was square cut, perhaps 2 feet on a side. Its corners were reinforced with iron bands. "Sarah," Patricia said softly. She was kneeling at the edge of the hole taking photographs. "I see it. We need to be careful with these. If they've been here since 1864, the wood is going to be fragile despite how it looks. The contents may shift if we move them roughly." Daniel widened the hole. He worked methodically, the way a man worked who understood that this was a moment that would be photographed and reviewed and entered into the record of something larger than itself. The first crate came up at 3 a.m. Daniel set it on the tarp. The 4 iron bands held. The wood dark and dense as ironwood held. The lid was nailed shut with hand-forged iron nails. Daniel used the pry bar, gently working each nail out one at a time until the lid came free. Inside, packed in straw that had been compressed to almost nothing over the years, were bars of gold. Each bar was perhaps 4 inches long, 2 inches wide, an inch thick. Each bar was stamped with a small Confederate seal and a date, 1862. Each bar caught the white light of the work lamp and threw it back in a way that gold did, and nothing else did. The particular soft yellow that human beings had been digging out of the earth for 10,000 years because nothing else looked quite like it. Patricia counted. There were 24 bars in the crate.
She did the math in her head and then on the back of her notebook. That's about 100 pounds of gold, she said, just in this crate. Daniel was looking at the bars with the expression of a man whose understanding of his own life had just shifted permanently. He was not greedy. Sarah understood that watching him. He was simply a sheriff in a small Vermont town who had agreed to help a woman dig in her own yard, and he was now looking at the largest single piece of physical evidence of a Civil War mystery that had been unsolved for 160 years. There are 40 more crates like this one, he said quietly.
Yes, Sarah said. Sarah. I know. They kept digging. They worked through the rest of the night. They did not bring everything up. The hole would have been visible from the road if they had widened it that much, and Sarah had decided without quite articulating the decision that what she needed first was proof, not the entire cache. She needed enough to demonstrate what was there. She needed enough to begin the legal process. The rest could stay in the ground a little longer.
They brought up 3 crates of gold. They brought up the 42nd crate, the one Eliza had labeled Papers of Importance to the Cause. They brought up the 43rd crate, the small separate one, the one marked in the different ing. They left the other 38 crates where they were. They filled the hole back in. They raked leaves and frozen needles over the disturbed earth until the south side of the oak tree looked in the gray light just before dawn, as if no one had touched it at all. They carried the 4 crates back to the house in the bed of Daniel's truck, under the tarp, down the back way along the creek, so that the truck never went past the road. In the kitchen, with the door locked and the curtains drawn, they opened crate 42. It was full of papers. The papers were in oilcloth, then in another layer of leather. They had survived the time underground without significant damage, the way papers could survive when they were sealed correctly and the ground was dry and the temperature was stable. The top document on heavy parchment bore a signature that Patricia recognized before her brain quite let her say the name out loud. It was the signature of Abraham Lincoln. Patricia put both her hands flat on the kitchen table. She stared at the document. She said nothing for almost a full minute. Then she said, "Sarah." "What is it, Patricia?" "This is a draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. It's not the final version. It's an earlier draft. It has corrections in the margins in Lincoln's own hand. This was thought to have been destroyed. There were rumors for years that an earlier draft existed and was carried south by an abolitionist contact, but no one ever found it." She turned the page over very carefully. "It is signed and dated September 1862. This is the draft he was working from in the weeks before he issued the preliminary proclamation." She kept looking through the stack. The next document was a list. It was 3 pages long. It was titled in a hand that was not Lincoln's
persons emancipated through the underground network of Virginia and the Carolinas 1861 to 1864. The list contained 312 names. Beside each name was a date, a place of origin, and a destination. Most of the destinations were in the northern states or in Canada. Patricia read through the names. Her hand was shaking slightly. "These are people," she said. "These are 312 people who escaped slavery through this network before the proclamation was issued. This list is a record of them. Their families have been trying to find documentation like this for 150 years. Sarah looked at the list. Solomon's name was on it, the first name on the page. Beside it in the same hand was the date April 19th, 1864, and a destination written in 2 words, Sparrow Hill. Sarah was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Let's open the last one." Crate 43 was small. It was perhaps a foot square. Daniel set it on the kitchen table and pried the lid off carefully. Inside, packed in the same compressed straw, was a single object wrapped in cloth. Sarah unwrapped it. It was a Bible. The leather binding was worn at the corners, but intact. The pages were thin and gilt-edged. On the inside cover, in a hand that was different from Eliza Whitlock's hand, a different hand entirely careful but less practiced, was an inscription. This Bible was carried by my mother Hannah, who learned to read from it in secret in the Hawthorne house, and from whom I learned to read in secret in the same place. I take it with me to freedom. I bury it now at Sparrow Hill beside the gold that is owed to my people and the papers that record their names, so that what was hidden may one day be found. If you who read this are of my blood, know that we did not steal. We took back what was stolen from us. If you are not of my blood, but are a friend of the work, treat what you have found with the honor it deserves. Solomon, May 31st, 1864. Sarah looked at the inscription for a long time. She thought about a man named Solomon, 40 years old, in the spring of 1864, who had held the keys to a wine cellar in a plantation house in Virginia and had used them to plan an escape over 2 years. She thought about a Bible carried out of slavery by a woman named Hannah, who had taught her son to read from it. She thought about a man who, before he went on into Canada, before he made his own way to the rest of his life, had taken the time to bury a separate crate with this single object in it, and had written in his own careful hand a message to whoever found it. She thought about the Reverend James Coleman in Atlanta, 67 years old, the great-great-great-grandson of Solomon, the man Patricia had identified 2 weeks earlier through the genealogical work. She thought this Bible is his. She closed the Bible carefully. She wrapped it in the cloth again. She did not put it back in the crate. She set it on the kitchen table in front of her, and she put both her hands flat on the wood beside it. And she sat there in the dawn light coming through the kitchen window of a house her great-great-grandmother had helped build. And she felt something settle in her chest that she had been carrying
without quite knowing it, since she had read the inscription in Eliza Whitlock's journal 3 weeks earlier. The promise had a name now. The promise had a face. The promise had a Bible with a careful inscription in a careful hand, written by a man who had been dead for 120 years and who had trusted before he died that someone would come. She looked at Patricia. She looked at Daniel. "We need to call Henry Caldwell," she said, "and we need to call Reverend Coleman in Atlanta. We are going to do this in the open. We are going to do it on record. We are going to do it in a way that no one can take it away from these people again." Patricia nodded. Daniel said very quietly, "Sarah, you understand that the moment you do this, Hawthorne is going to come at you with everything he has." "I know." "You understand he is not going to lose this without a fight." "I know that too, Daniel." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the gray dawn light. "Let him come," she said. Henry Caldwell arrived at 8 in the morning. He looked at the gold in the crates. He looked at the Lincoln draft. He looked at the list of 312 names. He looked at the Bible. He sat down at the kitchen table heavily. He did not speak for almost a minute. Then he said, "In 38 years of practicing law in Vermont, I have never seen anything like this. What do we do, Henry? We protect it first. Everything else after that." He took out a phone. He made 3 calls. The first was to a friend who was an attorney in Boston who specialized in civil rights cases. The second was to a curator at the Smithsonian Institution who he had known for 20 years. The third was to a contact at the FBI office in Albany who Caldwell did not name, but who he said, with the brief and slightly grim look of a man who had been around long enough to make useful friends, owed him a favor from 2007. By noon, the property had 3 federal agents on it. By 2, the Vermont State Police had cordoned off the road at the bottom of Sparrow Hill. By 4, the woman from the Smithsonian had arrived by helicopter from Washington with 2 assistants and a climate-controlled case the size of a small suitcase in which the Lincoln draft and the list of names were carefully placed for transport. She did not take possession of them. She authenticated them on the spot in the kitchen of the farmhouse with a portable lighted magnification rig and the calm, professional intensity of a woman who had spent her career handling exactly this kind of object and had never, she said with the small, almost smile of a person who had been waiting a long time to use the phrase, handled anything quite like this. She looked at Sarah at the end of her examination. "Ms. Mitchell," she said, "these documents are real. The Lincoln draft is real. The list of names is real. The Bible appears to be real. Whatever else is on this property, you have just changed American history." Sarah did not know what to say to that. She nodded. The woman from the Smithsonian smiled. "I have spent my whole career," she said quietly, "in rooms full of objects that I knew belonged to families who had lost them. I have spent my whole career watching those objects sit behind glass with little cards that did not name the people they belong to. I am going to help you do this right. She held out her hand. Sarah shook it. The first call to Reverend James Coleman in Atlanta went through at 6:30 that evening. Sarah sat at the kitchen table with the phone to her ear and her hand pressed flat against the cloth-wrapped Bible. Patricia sat across from her with a copy of Solomon's inscription. Daniel sat on the porch outside, giving them privacy. Henry Caldwell had gone back to town to begin drafting the legal framework that the next weeks would require. The phone rang 4 times. A man's voice answered. James Coleman, Reverend Coleman. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm calling from Vermont. I have a story to tell you that is going to take me a few minutes to get through. I would be grateful if you would hear me out before you decide what you think of it. A pause. Vermont, the voice said. It was a warm voice, deep and unhurried, the voice of a man who had been pastoring a church for 30 years and had heard a great many things he had not expected to hear. Yes. All right, Miss Mitchell, I am listening, Sarah told him. She told him about a great aunt she had never met who had left her a farmhouse. She told him about a journal under a stone in a chapel. She told him about Eliza Whitlock and 12 people who had come north from Virginia in 1864. She told him about Solomon. She told him about a Bible. She told him at the end about a hand-drawn inscription on the inside cover of a Bible that named Solomon's mother Hannah and named Solomon's promise to whoever found the crate. And she read the inscription aloud, slowly, in a voice that did not shake but came close. There was a long silence on the line when she finished. Then Reverend Coleman said, Ms. Mitchell, I am going to ask you to read that one more time. I want to make sure I heard it correctly. She read it again. The silence after the second reading was longer than the first. When the Reverend spoke, his voice had changed. It was quieter. It had the careful precision of a man who was holding something very carefully because he understood it could break. My grandfather, he said, used to tell me a story when I was small. He said his grandfather had told him. There was a man in our family named Solomon who had come north out of Virginia in the year before the war ended. The story said that Solomon and his people had brought something with them. The story said that they had buried it somewhere in the north with friends, and that one day the family would go back for it. He paused. I did not believe the story. I have not believed it since I was a boy. My grandfather believed it. He died believing it. My father believed it. He died believing it. I have buried 2 generations of my family who believed it, and I did not. He stopped. When he spoke again, his voice was thick. Ms. Mitchell, I have to ask you something. I have to ask it directly. Are you a person of good faith? Reverend Coleman, Sarah said, I am calling you because what is buried on my land belongs to your family. I want to bring you here. I want to put the Bible in your hands. I want you to take it home, and I want your family to decide together what to do with the rest of what is here.
I do not want anything from you. I do not want anything for myself. I have a great aunt who waited 33 years for the right person to come, and I am trying to be that person. Reverend Coleman was crying.
She could hear him. He did not try to hide it. I will be on a plane tomorrow morning, he said. Senator Richard Hawthorne held a press conference at 10 o'clock the next morning. He did it in the lobby of the state capitol in Montpelier with a row of cameras in front of him and a small crowd of reporters who had been called in on short notice. He stood at a podium in a charcoal suit and a maroon tie, and he announced with the calm authority of a man who had been planning the announcement for some time that he was filing a civil suit against Sarah Mitchell of Sparrow Hill Road in Brattleboro for the recovery of property belonging to the Hawthorne family that had been illegally removed from the Hawthorne estate in 1864 and was now, according to information that had recently come to his attention, in her possession. He said the property had been stolen during a chaotic moment of national history. He said the Hawthorne family had been trying to recover it for over a century. He said he hoped that the matter could be resolved in court without acrimony, but that he was committed to seeing his family's stolen property returned to its rightful heirs. He did not anywhere in the press conference use the word slavery. He did not anywhere in the press conference mention what kind of property he was talking about. The reporters asked questions. Hawthorne answered some and deflected others with the practiced skill of a 4-term state senator. The press conference lasted 12 minutes. By the time it was over, the story was being picked up by national outlets, and Sarah's phone had begun to ring. She did not answer. She had spent the morning preparing for Reverend Coleman's arrival. Daniel had driven down to the airport in Hartford to pick him up. Patricia was at the house with Henry Caldwell working through the legal documents. Emma was at school. The federal agents were still on the property. The road was still cordoned off. At 11, Henry Caldwell came into the kitchen with his phone in his hand. "It started," he said. He showed Sarah the news coverage on his phone. She watched a clip of Hawthorne at the podium, calm and authoritative, framing himself as a man fighting to recover what his family had lost. She watched a reporter speculate about the nature of the dispute. She watched a graphic flash on the screen that summarized the senator's career and his standing in Vermont politics. Then she set the phone down. "All right," she said. "Henry, what do we do? We hold our position. We do not respond publicly until we have to. We continue our work with the federal authorities and the Smithsonian. We bring Reverend Coleman here, and we begin the process of returning to his family what belongs to them. We let the senator file his suit. We let him explain in court, on the record, exactly what he is claiming and exactly what his family lost in 1864. We make him say it out loud in front of cameras what he means by stolen property." He looked at her. "Sarah, he cannot win this case. He can damage you. He can drag your name through the press. He can try to use his political weight to pressure people.
But the moment a judge has to weigh the rights of slaveholders against the rights of the enslaved, this country has settled that question. He cannot win. He can only embarrass himself, and the longer this goes on, the worse it will get for him. You don't think he knows that? I think he knows it intellectually. I think he is too used to getting what he wants to believe it about himself. He has spent his whole life inside a family that taught him this property was theirs. He cannot imagine standing in a courtroom and being told otherwise. He is going to make himself say it. And when he says it, this country is going to hear him. Sarah looked out the kitchen window at the front yard where a federal agent was walking the perimeter of the porch, and at the road beyond where the state police cruiser sat at the foot of Sparrow Hill, and at the great oak tree just visible through the trees to the east, where 38 crates of Confederate gold were still buried in the cold ground. "All right," she said. "Let him say it." Reverend James Coleman arrived at 4 in the afternoon. He was a tall man, 67 years old, with closely cropped gray hair and a careful posture that suggested both a long career in the pulpit and a recent surgery he was still recovering from. He wore a black suit and a clerical collar. He carried a small leather suitcase and nothing else. His daughter, a woman in her 40s named Marion, came with him. She was a hospital administrator in Atlanta. She had the same careful, observant intelligence in her face that her father had. Daniel drove them up from the airport. When they came into the kitchen of the farmhouse, Reverend Coleman stopped in the doorway. He looked at the room. He looked at the wood stove and the long pine table and the windows that opened onto the field beyond. He looked at the photograph on the parlor wall, visible through the open door of Margaret Whitlock, and the black woman in the dark dress on the front porch in the 1970s. He stood very still for a long moment. "My grandfather described this kitchen to me when I was a boy," he said quietly. "He said his father had described it to him. He said this was the kitchen where they were fed." Marion Coleman put her hand on her father's elbow. Sarah stood up from the table. She had set the Bible on a clean white cloth in the center with the inscription, "Page open." She did not say anything. She just stepped back and made room. Reverend Coleman walked to the table. He looked down at the Bible. He looked at the inscription. He read it through slowly, his lips moving over the words. Then he placed both his hands flat on the table on either side of the open Bible, and he bowed his head. He stood that way for a long time. When he finally lifted his head, his face was wet. "Solomon," he said quietly to the room and to no one in particular, and to the man who had been dead for 120 years and who had written the inscription in his own hand. "I have come. I am late, but I have come." Marion Coleman was crying. Patricia was crying. Sarah found that she was crying too quietly, the kind of crying that did not need to be acknowledged, because everyone in the room was doing it at the same time. The kind of crying that happened when something that had been carried
for 160 years was finally set down where it belonged. Daniel stood in the doorway of the kitchen with his hands at his sides and his hat in his hand, and he watched, and he said nothing. After a long time, Reverend Coleman lifted the Bible carefully. He held it against his chest. He looked at Sarah.
"Ms. Mitchell,"
He said.
Sarah, I want you to know something. I want you to know it before we discuss anything else. My family has been a family of believers for as long as we have been a family. We have been singing a song in our church for as long as I have been alive that ends with the line, "The truth shall set us free." I always thought it was a verse. I always thought it was scripture. My grandfather told me once that it was older than scripture in our family. He said it was something Solomon had said.
He said it was what Solomon meant by everything he did. He looked down at the Bible in his hands.
"Ms. Mitchell, the Latin on the key your great-aunt left you, Veritas liberat. The truth sets free."
Sarah felt a small, strange chill move along her spine.
"Yes," she said. "My grandfather did not know Latin. My great-grandfather did not know Latin. Solomon almost certainly did not know Latin. But somewhere in the years between him and my grandfather, someone in my family translated what he said into a different language and gave it back to your family as a key, as a way of saying, 'When we come back, you will know us.'"
Reverend Coleman smiled. It was a small, tired, grateful smile.
"Your great-aunt knew us, didn't she?"
"I think she did, Reverend. And now you do."
"Yes?"
He nodded.
"All right," he said. "Let us talk about what comes next."
What came next took 3 months. It was in the end simpler than anyone had expected. Reverend Coleman and his family did not want the gold. They wanted, they said with the simple clarity of a family that had decided this together before they arrived, that the gold be sold and the proceeds placed in trust for the descendants of the 312 people named on the list Sarah had found in crate 42. Many of those descendants were still findable. Many were not. The trust would be administered by a board that included Reverend Coleman, 3 other descendants of the original 12 who had escaped from the Hawthorne plantation, and 3 independent scholars of African American history. The Lincoln draft would go to the Library of Congress. The Bible would stay with the Coleman family. The list of 312 names would be published in full and given freely to every African American genealogical society in the country, so that the descendants of those people could find them. Sparrow Hill itself would become a museum, not a large museum. Sarah did not want a large museum. She wanted, she said to Patricia and Henry and Daniel one evening in the kitchen, a small one. A place where the story would be told honestly. A place where the people who had passed through this house on their way to freedom would be named. A place where the Whitlock family's role would be part of the story, but not the center of it. The center of the story would be Solomon and Hannah and the 12 people from the Hawthorne plantation and the 312 people from the list. The Whitlocks would be footnotes. the story would belong to the people whose lives had been at stake. Patricia agreed to be the curator. Henry agreed to handle the legal framework. Daniel did not agree to anything formally because Daniel was not in the business of agreeing to things formally. But he came every evening to the farmhouse after his shift. And he sat at the kitchen table, and he was in the way of small Vermont towns and quiet men simply there. He was there in the evenings. He was there at the dinners. He was there at the school events for Emma and Tommy. He was there when Sarah needed someone to talk to, and there when she needed someone not to talk. He was there. Senator Richard Hawthorne's lawsuit collapsed in 3 weeks. It collapsed the way Henry Caldwell had said it would. Hawthorne stood in front of a judge in Montpelier and was asked directly to specify the property he was claiming as having been stolen from his family. He was asked to identify when it had been stolen, who had stolen it, and under what legal theory the descendants of the people who had originally taken it possessed any obligation to return it. He could not answer those questions without saying the words. The words were that the property had been gold and that it had been taken in 1864 by people whom his family had held as slaves, and that he was now claiming on behalf of the family that had owned those people that the gold should be returned to him because they had owned it before the people they had owned took it from them. He tried 3 times to phrase this in a way that did not require him to say it directly. The judge would not let him. The press transcribed every word. When Hawthorne finally said on the record that he was claiming the gold as the property of his family because his family's enslaved laborers had taken it during their escape, the courtroom went very still, and the reporter from the Boston Globe wrote that line down word for word, and it ran on the front page of the Globe the next morning, and it ran on the wires the same day, and by the end of the week, it had run in every major newspaper in the country. Senator Richard Hawthorne announced his retirement from public office 11 days later. He cited family considerations. He withdrew the lawsuit. His chief of staff, the man whose cigarette butt Daniel Reed had found on the porch of Sarah's house at 3 a.m, was arrested 2 weeks after that on charges of trespassing, burglary, and conspiracy, and entered a plea agreement that named the senator as the man who had directed his actions. The senator was not himself indicted. He did not need to be. He had said what he had said in court on the record, and the rest of his political life had ended the moment those words left his mouth. He sold the family estate in 2027 and moved to Florida. Sparrow Hill opened to the public in the spring of 2027 on a clear, cold morning in late April, with the first green of the year coming up in the field below the house, and the apple trees in the old orchard at the south end of the property just beginning to bloom. The museum was small. It was housed in the farmhouse itself in the parlor, and the dining room and the kitchen with the chapel preserved as it had been the morning Sarah and Emma had opened the door for the first time and found the journal under the stone. The exhibitions were quiet and exact. They told the story of the 12 people from Virginia and the 312 names from the list, and the family that had kept the promise for 160 years. The Coleman family came up from Atlanta for the opening. So did 14 other families identified through the list, descendants of people who had passed through Sparrow Hill on their way north between 1849 and 1865. They came from Detroit and Toronto and Boston and Birmingham and Vancouver. They came from Houston and Philadelphia and a small town in Quebec called Sherbrooke, where one branch of one family had stayed and built a life, and where the descendants now spoke French. They stood on the front porch of the farmhouse. Reverend Coleman gave the dedication. He spoke for 10 minutes. He spoke about his great-great-great-grandfather Solomon, who had carried a Bible out of slavery. He spoke about a promise made on a hill in Vermont in the spring of 1864 by people who had no power except the power of choosing to trust each other. He spoke about a family of white Quakers who had hidden people in their cellar and fed them at their kitchen table and never asked for anything in return except the chance to do it again the next time someone needed them. He spoke about Margaret Whitlock, who had refused $2 million and waited 33 years for the right person to come. He spoke about Sarah Mitchell. He said only this. He said that Sarah Mitchell had inherited a promise. He said that promises were the heaviest thing a family could leave to its descendants. He said that some promises were kept and some were not, and that the difference between the two was almost always a matter of whether someone at the right moment decided to stay. He said that Sarah had stayed. He said that on behalf of his family and on behalf of every family whose names were on the list inside the museum, he thanked her, and he asked God's blessing on her and on her daughter and on the man standing beside her, who was a sheriff in a small Vermont town and a good man, and on the boy who was holding her daughter's hand on the porch step. That night, after everyone had gone, Sarah and Emma walked out alone to the oak tree at the eastern edge of the property. The ground had been restored after the federal team had finished its work. The hole was gone. The crates of gold had been removed under federal supervision and were now being prepared for auction under the trust that Reverend Coleman's family had established, with the proceeds going to the descendants Patricia had been spending her days helping to find. The oak tree stood as it had stood for 228 years, dark against the spring sky, its lower branches just beginning to show the first faint green of new leaves. Sarah and Emma stood under the tree. It was very quiet. Emma was 8 now. She had grown 2 inches over the winter. She had Tommy as her best friend at school. She had a chicken in the stone barn, no longer imaginary, a russet hen named Beatrice, whom she fed every morning. She had a bedroom on the 2nd floor of the farmhouse with a window that faced east and a small framed photograph of the chandelier from the parlor on the table beside her bed, which she had asked for and which Sarah had given her. She held her mother's hand. "Mom," she said. "Yes, baby." "The lady in the chapel, she isn't here anymore." "No. She left a few days ago. She said it was all right now. She said I could tell you." Sarah looked down at her daughter in the spring twilight. "What did she say exactly?" Emma thought about this for a long moment, the way she always did
when she was being asked to remember something carefully.
She said, "Tell your mother that we are all going home now. The ones who were left here. We are all going home."
She said, "Thank her for me." Sarah felt the tears come up and did not fight them. She crouched down. She held her daughter close. She felt Emma's small arms come around her neck, the way they had on a sidewalk in Baltimore on a night in October 18 months ago, when there had been $287 in her coat and no plan beyond the next hour.
"Mom,"
Emma said into her shoulder. "Yes, sweetheart."
"Are we home now?"
Sarah looked up past her daughter's small shoulder at the great oak tree at the field beyond, at the lights of the farmhouse coming on in the distance, at the chapel just visible in the deeper dark of the cedar stand. She thought about a brass key with 2 Latin words on it. She thought about a man who had buried a Bible in the spring of 1864 and trusted that someone would come.
She thought about a great aunt who had waited 33 years.
She thought about her daughter, who was the reason she had not given up on a sidewalk in Baltimore on a night when giving up had been very close.
"Yes, Emma," she said quietly. "We are home now."
Emma nodded against her shoulder, satisfied the way only a 7-year-old, or in this case, an 8-year-old, could be satisfied with a simple, true answer. They walked back toward the house together, hand in hand, across a field that the Whitlock family had walked for 179 years in a country that had kept its hardest promises slowly and unevenly, and sometimes only because one person at the right moment had decided to stay. The lights of the farmhouse glowed warm in the spring dusk. Daniel was on the porch waiting for them. Tommy was at his side. Beyond them, the door of the house stood open. Beyond the door, the front hall ran the length of the house, and the floors were the same wide plank pine they had been when they were laid in 1847, and the staircase rose to the right with its hand-carved banister of leaves and small birds, and above the writing desk in the parlor, the framed photograph still hung of Margaret Whitlock and the black woman in the dark dress, the two of them looking out at the world the way the people who had kept promises looked out at the world with quiet eyes and steady hands, with the knowledge that some things took a long time, and some things took a lifetime, and some things took longer than a lifetime, and that what you did when you were given a promise to keep was simply this: you kept it. You kept it until the right person came, and then you handed it to them, and you let them carry it the rest of the way home.